Hey there, and welcome to the SLP Now podcast. We are kicking off a series on all things Gestalt language processing. So, for the next several episodes, we have a variety of guests to help us break down this topic. And I'm really excited to have Jessica Teixeira with us today. She is a certified speech language pathologist with a passion for supporting professionals and parents on their journey in learning about Gestalt language development and neurodiversity affirming practices. You can find her on Instagram at just the SLP, and then I'll link to her other places you can find her in the show notes, which will be linked in the episode. But the bio that I just kind of shared does Jessica no justice. So let's turn it over to Jessica and hear from her. So hello, Jessica.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you kick off the series with us. And before we dive into all things GLP, I'm really curious just to hear a little bit more about your story. Like, how did you end up learning so much about GLP and kind of what led you down this route?
Yeah, so a little about my story and how I ended up here is in my clinical fellowship year, I worked at a clinic where I mainly supported autistic students, and about 90% of my caseload was autistic. And I was doing all of the things that we were taught in grad school and just kept thinking what I was doing didn't feel right. I wasn't seeing the progress with my clients that I was taught that I should see. And what I would see very limited progress or some progress, and then it would plateau. And I also saw that my clients really didn't enjoy my sessions. Like, I think they liked me as a clinician, but they just weren't having fun. Honestly, I didn't enjoy my sessions either. I was so passionate about being an SLP. It's something I've wanted to be for so long. My mom worked in the school. She's worked in the school since she was 18 years old. And I would always go to school with her. And at first I wanted to be a teacher. And then I saw an SLP do a push-in. And I was like, that is what I want to do. And then I was actually in these sessions as a full-on SLP. And I was like, what's going on? I don't enjoy being here. My clients don't enjoy being here. I'm not seeing the progress that they're telling me I should see. There has to be something else. And I honestly started questioning if this was even really the field for me. And so I honestly, in a last ditch effort, went to Google and this is probably the type 5 Enneagram in me. If anybody knows anything about Enneagrams, I'm a type 5. I don't know if that says anything, but I just need to understand everything about everything. And so I just deep dive into other ways that I could support my clients. And all of a sudden, Marge Blanc's book, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum, popped up. And I was like, interesting. Let me deep dive into that more. And then Alexandria Zakos's work with meaningful speech very, very early on, like right when she started meaningful speech, started coming on my Instagram feed. And so it was like these two worlds, Marge's book and Alex's work collided. And I was like, just deep dived into everything that they were saying. I was reading Marge's book every day after work. I was like so just amazed by everything Alex was posting on Instagram. And it just felt right. Like it looked like exactly what I had been looking for. And then, so honestly, I just was like, I might as well try it, right? Like what else is, what do I have to lose? And so I started implementing a lot of these strategies that they were talking about. Everything changed. My clients started enjoying my sessions more. I started loving my job, and then I was actually seeing the progress that I was told that I should be seeing. And the rest is kind of history. I just absolutely fell in love with supporting Gestalt language processors, and that's how I connected with Alexandria Zakos and joined the meaningful speech team, started my practice supporting Gestalt language processors, and here we are.
That's amazing. I love that. And I feel like your story is one that a lot of SLPs can relate to. I've heard a variation of that for a lot of different areas. So I love that you kind of persevered and even like you were a problem solver and you're trying to like figure out how to find that joy in being an SLP. And it sounds like you were super successful.
I think so.
I love that. Okay. So thank you so much for sharing your story. And so now we get to get into a little bit of the nitty gritty. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So can you walk us through what GLP is and kind of a super quick primer in terms of like if an SLP hasn't heard about it yet?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I always start by saying I think it's helpful to think of language processing as a continuum. So a continuum from analytic language processing to Gestalt language processing. And what this means is some children might be fully analytic, some children might be fully Gestalt, and some children might fall somewhere between the two. So when I talk about Gestalt language processing, and probably through the rest of this episode, I'm mostly referring to the children that fall more towards that Gestalt side of the spectrum. But let's start with what analytic language processing is and then dive into GLP. So analytic language processing is something that all SLPs, parents, really anybody who's listening to this is probably familiar with. These are children that we refer to as word babies. And these are the children that start with single words. These single words are flexible to start. They're referential. And these single words hold an individual meaning for that child. These single words then in stage 2 become 2-word combinations and then 3-word phrases and then early grammar in sentences, more advanced grammar, and then they're having adult-like conversations, right? This sounds very familiar. What we learned about in grad school, what we see in most doctors' offices on charts and where your child should be. But the word that I really like to point out with analytic language processors is flexible. So their language is flexible to start. So right from that stage 1, that language is flexible, referential. You can build on it as they move through the stages. With Gestalt language processors, they are what we refer to as intonation babies. So they start with chunks of language and they pick up these chunks based on the intonational contour of that chunk and also the experience from when they heard it. So it typically holds a much larger meaning for that child in that whole experience from when they heard that chunk. They pick up these chunks verbatim, and these chunks are not flexible. These chunks can be any length, so they could be a single word, they can be a sentence, or I think as Mark Blanc says, it can be as short as a single word or as long as a movie. But again, they're not flexible. Unlike analytic language processors, they can't be expanded on. They can't be combined into longer utterances. And these chunks are often referred to as echolalia or scripting. And they're actually more accurately described as Gestalt. And that is the first stage of Gestalt language development. And like analytic language processors, they move through very predictable stages. So they start with these chunks that are not flexible. In stage 2, they become a little bit more flexible. They can start to mix and match or trim them down. In stage 3, they start to isolate single words from those previous gestalts that are now flexible, just like where analytic language processors start. And then those stages start to look a little bit more similar, but Gestalt language processors have to go through 2 additional stages before they really get to where analytic language processors start.
Wow, that was such a nice overview. I love how you broke down those two and how we can think of like analytic language processors as the word babies and the Gestalt language processors as the intonation babies. And you did just a beautiful job of differentiating. So thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the history behind this and maybe like just what your perception is of like, why are we so focused on the analytic language processors? Like, why didn't we learn about this in grad school? Like, what's your take on that?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite questions. So I talk to many, many, many people because I do professional consultations, I do in-person and virtual trainings and professional development. So I'm connecting with SLPs and professionals from various experience levels. So new, more experienced. And what I've come to learn is One, GLP has been around for a while. If you talk to SLPs who have been in the field for a while, SLPs who have been practicing since the 70s, the 80s, or around that time, they'll tell you, I know about GLP. Like, this is nothing new. I've heard about this. They'll refer to Dr. Barry Prezant. They'll refer to Dr. Ann Peters. They'll say, I know the research. I know echolalia is meaningful. I don't know, why this seems like a new thing to so many people, because they learned about it. They saw this research. They learned about it in grad school. They've been practicing like echolalia is meaningful and acknowledging it and all the things that we're kind of discussing now. So this research has been around since the 70s and 80s. So like I said, Dr. Barry Prezant, Dr. Ann Peters, they published research back then. And then Dr. Prezant in his research really called for more research. And what happened is Marge Blanc read this research and was like, I can do that. I can provide more research on this. So what she did is conduct 15 years of clinical research in her clinic on her clients. And she wrote the book that I referred to earlier, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum, on that 15 years of clinical research. And what she did is she created the natural language acquisition framework, which really discussed how we can support these children. And she took the stages that Barry Prezant discussed in his research, those first 4 stages, and then she built on those and she added 2 additional stages, which really focus more on advanced and complex grammar. Then from there, what happened is Marge's book was published in 2012, and people came across Marge's book. People like Alex Zakos, who's the founder of Meaningful Speech, where she was like, this is everything I've been looking for. I think we have very similar stories, just different times, where Alex had been practicing for many years into being an SLP, and she was feeling the same way. And she came across Marge's book, and she was like, how do people not know about this? So what she did is she realized that so many people in this field are on social media, and she found that to be a great way to spread this information about Gestalt language processing so that people would know that this exists. And I guess to answer, I got a bit off on a tangent. I'm going to reel myself back and say, between Dr. Prezant and Ann Peters' work and Marge's book, our field went in a very different direction. Our field went a lot more in a compliance-based direction, and those strategies really are the opposite of how we support Gestalt language processors. And so it was taught back then, and then our field went more in that compliance-based direction. And all this information kind of got pushed to the side. It's not that it didn't exist, but people weren't taught about it until Marge's book came out. And then Alex got on social media, people learned about it, and here we are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's super interesting that how social media kind of helped revamp this a little bit.
Right. It's such a great tool. I mean, so many people are on social media to learn and connect with each other. I think sometimes people think of it as just this social media thing and it blew up on social media, but it's really such a good tool for us to connect in this profession and to learn and, just think more critically about what we're doing. And Alex saw that as an opportunity, and I'm so glad she did, because that's how, one of the ways that I came across this information.
Yeah. Wow. And our scope of practice is so broad, and there's so much research. Like if we were just going straight to the research, like digging up the articles from the 70s and 80s, a lot less people would have access to those.
Absolutely. And another thing with social media too is it's allowed us to connect with actual Gestalt language processors, autistic adults who have said, this is exactly how I process language. This is it. And so we've been able to connect and hear from them, and we're able to gain that part of evidence-based practice from the actual clients sharing their experiences and saying, hey, yes, this is how I process language. This is how I develop language. And yes, these things that you're saying are exactly, what supported us in getting to self-generated, self-motivated language. So it's a great tool.
That is a tool. And yeah, that's important to consider the whole triangle and not just the research aspect. So
Sure is.
that's great. And then, okay, so that was a really helpful overview. And so I think we have like a pretty good idea now, but let's just drive this point home. So why is it important for SLPs to learn about Gestalt language processing? And like, can we just highlight a few ways that this could help us like better support our students?
Absolutely. So, like I said earlier, we were taught about analytic language processing in grad school, and that means we were taught about strategies that support analytic language processors. So those are strategies like expansion or building vocabulary and labeling or WH questions, focusing on grammar and, grammar early on. And those things might work for analytic language processors, but they don't support Gestalt language processors in the early stages. And so if we are just using these strategies with all of the clients that we're supporting, then we're really only supporting analytic language processors. And what we're actually doing, whether, if we don't know about Gestalt language processing, it might be well-intended, just like me before I learned about it. And I was saying I was doing all these things and it was well-intended. And I looked up to my clients and I wanted to see progress, but I was actually hindering their progress by using these strategies, because what these strategies do is they can keep Gestalt language processors stuck in the early stages. So I'll give you an example. If we are using a strategy like building vocabulary or labeling, what happens is we focus on labeling, and whether we're naturally labeling things around the room or we're teaching children the, single word labels for things, we're building up a repertoire of these single word gestalts, because remember, that's where it starts, is these chunks of language that can be of any length. So if we're teaching or modeling these single words, they're picking up this single word as a chunk. And going back to what I said, these chunks aren't flexible. So if we build up a repertoire of hundreds of single words, which I see with many of my clients, these are single words that can't be expanded on. They can't be, right? They can't be built upon. They can't be expanded on. They are inflexible. And it makes it so it's really hard for that child to go from stage one and move through the stages, because they have all of these single words that can't be combined and they can't be combined into these longer self-generated phrases and sentences. So if we understand Gestalt language development, we can see the long-term picture, right? We can see these children can get to self-generated flexible language, but we can't rush it. We need to start where they are. So if a child is in stage one, no matter how old they are, right? If they're a 10-year-old who's in stage one, we might wish that they could have these back and forth conversations, because that's what we want for that child, but we have to start where they are. So it's important that we understand the stages so that we're not trying to rush them and in return hindering their ability to get to self-generated, self-motivated, flexible language. So if we understand Gestalt language development and we understand the stages, we understand what our goals are and how to support these children to get to self-generated language.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so if we're seeing a student who is like maybe like picking up the single words, but we're not seeing them go to the start to combine the words, then that might be a really strong indicator that we want to consider using a different approach. And there are a lot of other things that we'll see in addition to lack of progress, but we'll dive into that in future episodes in the series. So we'll have an episode where we dive into the different stages and assessment strategies and all sorts of steps. So there's some really, really great content coming because you might be leaving this episode with more questions than answers. But this was meant to be the primer just to get us on the same page. And yeah, so I'm really excited to continue learning. And then Jessica, thank you so much for breaking this down in such a nice way. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of wrap up with or share?
I think my only piece of advice is to trust your gut, like I did in those early years in my clinical fellowship. If what you're doing doesn't feel right, or if you're feeling like there could be something else, just explore it. Don't just keep doing what you're doing because that's what you were taught. There might be another way, and just make sure that every client that comes through your door, you take an individualized approach to that client. And yeah, I think that's where I'd like to leave it.
Yeah, beautifully said. And then I mentioned that you're just the SLP on Instagram and your website is playhavenpediatrics.com. Is there anywhere else?
So I also am on the Meaningful Speech Instagram as well. I'm on the Meaningful Speech team, and I just recently joined the Uniquely Human team with Dr. Barry Prezant. So you'll likely see me more there as well. So I'm on both of those accounts.
It's amazing. So I'll link to all of those. And then we'll hear from Alex from Meaningful Speech in a couple episodes too. So you'll get to our listeners will get to meet her. And yeah, I'm excited for all the great content. So thanks for kicking us off, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.